again. This is Dr. Jackie Gardner-Nix and Christie Tate, nurse practitioner. We're chatting about migraines, our own experience, and also our experiences of treating migraines. But in this short session, we're going to reflect back on when we first noticed we had migraines back in the childhood areas of our lives and what happened to bring this to our attention. Clearly, we were suffering from headaches, but what was the real root? How did it start? So, Christy, do you want to talk about your early experience?
Yeah, sure. So, I think what's kind of underappreciated with migraine is that it is often onset in childhood. It presents in a little bit of a different way. It may not be well recognized. But for myself, I was definitely one of those about 10% of kids who suffer from migraine. I was a child that had headache episodes. I do remember, going to the office at school and them calling my parents to pick me up. The other feature that I had that's very common, or kind of common presentation for migraine in kids, is motion sickness and lots of kind of tummy aches. So I was incredibly car sick. I remember there was a point where my parents were sort of shopping for a new house, and we would go, this is before MLS, and you had to drive and go look at houses, and it was the worst. I was like, I never want to get in a car and drive around at looking places again. So lots of car sickness, motion sickness, and headaches. They did take me to our doctor at one point. I did have some tests and investigations done, and then they were just said, everything's normal, it's fine. So, I think it speaks to the fact that if there's not something big and bad kind of happening in your brain, then it's just kind of considered nothing to worry about. And I did go on to really struggle, particularly, adolescence is another time with hormonal shifts that things get worse. And my early 20s, I was quite impacted by migraine. And I know we've kind of shared our stories with each other, Jackie, but tell us a little bit about how migraine presented itself in your life.
Yeah, very. It was actually when I was going through puberty, and I remember getting my first migraine, and I think it did have blanking out of sight in a class, a French class at school. I was in England at the time. I didn't emigrate to Canada till I was 32, and it was actually a kind of appropriate because my parents were moving from London, England, to Cornwall for my father's health because he had TB and he needed the clean air. And we're going back many years because I'm late career, and so this would be 50 years back. And Dad had to come and pick me up from school. The following week, I got the same migraine, or rather, I got in the same class, I got a migraine again, and Dad came again to pick me up. And at that time, of course, we didn't label it migraines. We didn't know what it was. We just knew it was a severe headache. And I recognized that my body was giving me a message because it was apprehensive about moving from a big city school to a small town school and what that might do for my education. And I really didn't have an anticipation that it would be a big deal, but it was. It was very hard to move to an area where I couldn't really understand the accent very well. I was an outsider, and school was about a year behind where I had been. So I went to university a year later by moving down there, much that it was a lovely environment and it was close to where my sister lived as well. So my parents could be close to the grandchildren as they arrived. So it was obviously a huge stressor. But thinking back to, I had abdominal pain recurrently at schools when I was in elementary school as well, where my father had to come and pick me up. And it was only recently when I was listening to a lived experience sufferer from migraine, somebody who was in their 20s, who was debriefing us at one of the Pain Society conferences, and how she mentioned the abdominal pain and the car sickness, which is really quite common in those who go on to suffer migraine headaches. It's really not well recognized in children to suffer from migraines, but you evolve and eventually all the pieces come together. And hopefully it's quicker to diagnose now than it was way back then, because it was pretty disabling at the times.
Yeah, and I don't really work with pediatric patients so much anymore. I did previously, and I think sometimes, it's hard for parents to believe that maybe their child has migraine. Aren't they too young? Isn't this, how could they have this? And I think we have to remember that migraine is a neurological condition or a neurological disease, it can be called. It's often, you are a migraine sufferer for your life. And I think recognizing it in childhood is an important time. It kind of can empower you to manage it a little bit better. I think if I went to university with some of the tools that I have now, I may have been able to kind of, weather the changes of leaving home for the first time, having lots of stress disruption in my schedule, which was a really impactful time for my migraine. So it's common in kids. It looks a little bit different, which is why it's not always recognized. But they can be sensitive to many of the same triggers that we're sensitive to, right? Worries and stresses and sort of disruptions in routine. You mentioned before how kind of sensitive the migraine brain is, and it's true, right? You might not even mentally be recognizing that, but your body will tell you when it's
Yeah, the body often does tell us when we're stressed, actually, more so than
yeah.
sometimes the mind will. Or, it doesn't come to the conscious as much as it's embedded in the body. And yeah, I had a strong family history of migraines too. So, although we know that 1/3 of those suffering from migraine, there is no family history, 2/3 there is. It is a true biochemical change or difference in our systems that leads us to have a predisposition to migraines. Both my parents suffered from migraines, but I didn't recognize it when I was a child. And according to my mother, her father suffered profound migraines, of course not labeled in those days because his life was the late 1880s to, sorry, 1880s into the next century. And so he was apparently holding his head in his hands because it was so severe, and that must have been migraine headaches in those days. So familial for me, but not necessarily for everybody.
And for
Okay.
me, not. So my parents don't have migraine, so it was a bit of a different thing for them to encounter. Farther back in my family history, yes, but not my parents. I was just curious, Jackie, when did you kind of get that diagnosis and it was called migraine, other than by yourself?
I think when I was in university, and the physician that looked after us as students would have diagnosed that for me. So, and sometimes I think we both notice that you have to become a healthcare professional to see the pattern and to understand that actually, oh yes, as I'm learning about migraines, this is what I have. Because an awful lot of people are not diagnosed. And I think, didn't you have a statistic that said 40% of people are never diagnosed with their migraine headaches?
Yeah, only about 40% are. Yeah, so
Oh,
there's quite a
40%
few that
are.
are
Yes.
are, are not.
Yeah.
For lots of reasons. They're maybe not going to their healthcare provider, they're just sort of living with it. The perception is it's maybe something else, or it's just misdiagnosed.
And
Um,
yeah, and actually, it may be very sporadic. So it may happen extremely infrequently, but then that frequency can change as life goes on.
yeah,
Or you may become a chronic migraine sufferer where your head feels sensitive all the time, and there is that sense of being on the brink of a migraine all the time. I didn't have that early on. And we need to talk a little bit in another recording about how that can change in pregnancy and postmenopausally and so on. In fact, two of my children have had migraines, both at extremely stressful times in their lives. And when I talk to them about it now, a few years later, they almost can't remember that. So if a physician said, "Did you ever have migraines?" they might actually say no, but I remember that they had them. So interesting to think we blank out some very painful things,
yeah,
and maybe some of it can be when it's very infrequent migraines and we just don't recognize or don't remember them later.
yeah, yeah. Or
Okay,
it's just not a part of our identity, right? You don't recognize yourself as a migraine sufferer. Yeah,
that's
so
true. Yes. Okay, we'll look at and visit other aspects of our experience with migraines and also our experience of treating them in future recordings. So hope to see you again soon.
thanks for joining, everyone.